1841, Hartford, the tragic wedding. The mother-in-law who poisoned the bride dawn crept softly over Hartford on an October morning in 1841, staining the windows of Trinity Episcopal Church with pale light as carriages lined the street and silk skirts whispered across stone. What was meant to be a celebration of promise would instead become a vision of horror burned into the city's memory. Beneath the vaulted ceiling, before faces polished by privilege and expectation, a young bride lifted a cup of ceremonial wine. The moment it touched her lips, joy curdled into terror. Bridget O'Sullivan stiffened, her breath shuddering, her body folding inward as though struck by an invisible hand. White froth blossomed at her mouth, staining the lace she had sewn herself, and her wedding gown pooled like fallen snow around her convulsing form. Her voice escaped in a rasp that echoed far too clearly. The wine, it burns, then the church filled with screams. 3 days later, when whispers had hardened into fear, the truth emerged like rot beneath polished wood. What happened at the altar was not an accident, nor a cruel twist of fate, but a murder planned with chilling patience. The one responsible had watched calmly from among the guests, eyes steady, hands folded, witnessing each spasm with the serenity of someone observing the final act of a long-rehearsed play. Hartford's newspapers recoiled from the details, fearful that printing the full account would ignite public fury. Yet silence could not bury what had been done. This was not merely a death, it was a revelation. Hartford at that time balanced uneasily between tradition and change. The Connecticut River carried steamships heavy with goods and ambition, while factories rose beside steeples, their chimneys clawing at the sky. Wealth accumulated quickly, but so did resentment. Irish immigrants poured into the city, drawn by the promise of wages and survival, settling near the rail yards in cramped quarters. That bred suspicion as easily as disease. To the old families, these newcomers were a threat not only to employment, but to identity itself. Among Hartford's elite stood Elenina Petton, a widow carved from discipline and pride. Her mansion on Prospect Street, all brick and iron and manicured restraint, was a monument to social order. She had married into fortune, clawed her way upward through intelligence and relentless control, and when her husband died suddenly, she tightened her grip rather than loosening it. The estate was vast, the name respected, and her will absolute. Everything she had endured, every loss and humiliation of her early life, was justified by what she had built, and at the center of it all stood her son. William Petton was her miracle, born after grief had hollowed her, raised as proof that fate had finally yielded to her demands. He was educated, refined, and destined in her mind to carry the family name forward without stain. When he returned from Yale admired and eligible, she watched every glance cast in his direction, measuring women like risks in a ledger. No one would be good enough unless Elenina herself approved. Bridget O'Sullivan never stood a chance. The O'Sullivans arrived quietly without fanfare or apology. Patrick O'Sullivan worked hard, earned respect, and kept his children close. Bridget, with her copper hair and clear gaze, moved through Hartford with a gentleness that disarmed those who expected civility. As a seamstress, she touched the finest fabrics, stitched elegance for women who rarely noticed the hands that served them. Her voice carried intelligence, her manners restraint. She did not shrink. That alone was unforgivable. When William met Bridget at a public lecture, their connection startled him. She spoke with curiosity, not deference. She listened. Their meetings multiplied, watched from behind curtains and over teacups. To Hartford society, it was a curiosity. To Elenina, it was an invasion. An Irish Catholic girl, daughter of a laborer, threading herself into the Petton lineage. Each polite smile Bridget offered felt like a blade. Elenina warned her son with honeyed words and veiled concern. She spoke of reputations, of futures ruined by careless affection. William resisted gently, then firmly. He loved Bridget. The wedding was set. From that moment, something in Elenina hardened. Letters were written, conversations held in shadow. A plan formed, not in rage, but in resolve. She studied poisons with the same care she once devoted to investments, selecting one that would act swiftly, violently, and beyond easy detection. On the morning of the wedding, she moved through her home with ritual calm, preparing herself for what she believed was necessary. When the wine was poured, no one noticed her glance linger. When Bridget fell, Elenina did not cry out. She did not faint. She watched. The aftermath shattered Hartford's illusions. The investigation uncovered traces of poison no servant could have accessed, no stranger could have slipped unnoticed. The truth pointed upward, toward respectability, toward a mother whose devotion had twisted into possession. Society recoiled, unable to reconcile gentility with such cruelty. Elenina Petton was arrested, her mansion suddenly a mausoleum of silence. Bridget O'Sullivan was buried in borrowed ground, her dreams folded into the earth. William was left hollow, his name intact, but his life ruined. Hartford moved on, factories humming, ships passing, but something had shifted. A truth had surfaced that could not be forgotten. Because sometimes the most dangerous monsters do not lurk in alleys or shadows. Sometimes they sit beside you in church, smiling softly, waiting for the moment when love dares to cross a line they have drawn in blood. William noticed her before he understood why. She sat among the workers in the rear benches, where coats were worn thin and hands bore the quiet marks of labor, while others shifted or whispered. Bridget O'Sullivan leaned forward, eyes fixed on the speaker as if every word mattered. There was a gravity to her attention that unsettled him, a sense that she was not merely listening but absorbing something meant to change her. When the lecturer invited questions, silence stretched. Then her hand rose, steady and unafraid. She spoke of poetry carried across oceans, of Irish verse echoing through American voices, of sorrow transformed into language that refused to die. The question rippled through the room, drawing startled glances from polished heads unaccustomed to insight coming from that section of the hall. William felt something shift inside him, a click like a lock turning. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed into the damp Hartford evening, he approached her. He introduced himself with a formality drilled into him since childhood, yet his tone betrayed curiosity rather than superiority. Bridget met his gaze without shrinking, her cheeks warmed, but her words were clear, unembellished, confident. When they stepped into the street together, conversation flowed with surprising ease. They spoke of books devoured by candlelight, of borrowed volumes passed hand to hand, of ideas discovered in unlikely places. William learned that her education had not been granted but claimed, page by page, thought by thought. At the corner where their paths parted, he hesitated, caught off guard by his own reluctance to let the moment end. When he asked if she might attend another lecture with him, her smile was small but luminous, as though hope had been given permission to breathe. From that night forward, their meetings became a quiet ritual. Walks along the river, shared silence broken by laughter, discussions that blurred the rigid lines Hartford society had drawn so carefully. William knew the danger. He knew how names carried weight, how bloodlines were treated like currency. Yet Bridget's presence dismantled those fears one by one. With her the world felt honest. With her he felt free. For months this secret bloomed unseen. Elenina Petton, vigilant guardian of appearances, suspected nothing. Her son's absences were easily explained by ambition, by masculine pursuits befitting his station. She did not imagine love could grow beyond her sight. But truth has a way of announcing itself when least desired. It came on a suffocating summer afternoon. Elenina climbed the familiar stairs to William's office, a pitcher of lemonade cooling her palm, her thoughts fixed on invitation's influence. Then voices slipped beneath the door. William's voice, warm and resolute, and another, unmistakably female. The words froze her in place. He spoke of defiance, of exhaustion, of a life shaped by her hands alone. He spoke of love. The woman's reply carried an accent that struck Elenina like a slap. Soft, careful, respectful, yet undeniably airish. Each syllable ignited something corrosive in her chest. She heard her son confess what she had never allowed him to name, that his life had been orchestrated, his choices rationed, his future owned. He said he was done. Done? Elenina pressed herself against the wall, breath shallow, fingers whitening around the glass handle until she feared it might shatter. When William spoke of marriage, of presenting this woman to her as his chosen bride, something inside her fractured. The sound of movement within the office jolted her back to herself. She fled without a word, leaving the untouched lemonade behind like an offering rejected. The carriage ride home blurred into a fever of thought. Shock curdled into fury, and fury into something colder, more deliberate. An Irish girl. An immigrant. A nobody. threatening to dismantle everything she had engineered with such care. Every sacrifice, every maneuver, every quiet cruelty she had justified in the name of legacy now trembled on the brink of ruin. She convinced herself of a story where her son was innocent, manipulated, ensnared by calculated charm. It was easier to believe that than accept he had chosen against her will. That evening, William returned home radiant. He hummed as he ate, joy clinging to him like a fragrance Elenina had never detected before. She studied him with a predator's patience, memorizing the evidence of betrayal etched into his happiness. Though rage clawed at her throat, she buried it beneath practiced civility. She had learned long ago that haste was the enemy of control. When she remarked on his good spirits, he did not deny it. He spoke of change, of decisions long delayed. When he finally told her he intended to marry, her hand trembled just enough to betray the effort it took to remain composed. She forced delight into her voice, forced interest, forced herself not to scream. Then he spoke her name, Bridget O'Sullivan. The words echoed in Elenina's mind long after William fell silent. In that moment, something irrevocable took root. Not grief, not disappointment, but resolve. Because to Elenina Peton, love was not sacred. It was a weakness to be corrected. And no force, not youth, not passion, not innocence itself, would be allowed to sever her grip on the life she believed was hers to command. The shadows in Hartford were already lengthening, and somewhere, unseen, a path toward the altar was being quietly poisoned. She spoke the truth at last, and the truth struck like glass against bone. Ireland, 2 years in Hartford, an Irish family. The words barely left William's mouth before Elenina's grip failed her. The crystal tumbler slid from her fingers and shattered against porcelain. Sharp crack echoing far too loudly in the refined quiet of the dining room. For a fleeting instant, the mask slipped. Then it returned. "How careless of me," she murmured, already rising, already reaching for the bell. Her voice was smooth, almost amused, as if nothing inside her had fractured. She repeated the name softly, testing it. O'Sullivan, Irish. The syllable tasted bitter, poisonous. William continued, unaware or unwilling to notice the tension tightening the air. He spoke of factories and dress shops, of honest work, of a girl who earned her living with needle and skill. Elenina listened with rigid stillness, her expression serene, her thoughts boiling. When William tried to soften the moment, to reassure her that he understood what she might be thinking, she cut him off with precision. She was not thinking anything at all, she claimed. She was merely surprised. He had never spoken of this young woman before. He told her why. He wanted certainty, and now he had it. He said the word love. He said he would ask for her hand. That night, Elenina retreated into her private sitting room and paced until the rich carpet bore the ghost of her steps. Back and forth, each pass carried the weight of everything she stood to lose. The vision unfolded before her with merciless clarity. Doors closing, invitations rescinded, smiles stiffening into polite avoidance, a paternaire bound to an immigrant bride, his children trapped between worlds belonging nowhere, marked forever by the stain of their origin, and worse than the whispers was the ledger. Marriage meant power shifting hands. Marriage meant legal claims. Marriage meant that girl with her soft accent and humble past would have a voice in matters Elenina had controlled for years. The fortune, the investments, the legacy, all vulnerable to influence she could not command. She imagined money bleeding into Catholic parishes, into foreign relatives, into causes that offended every value she had clawed her way upward to defend. The thought made her stomach twist. She had not risen from merchant stock to Hartford's upper ranks to be undone by an Irish seamstress. In the weeks that followed, Elenina became meticulous. She asked questions that sounded like concern. She listened to gossip dressed as curiosity. She learned everything. Patrick O'Sullivan was dependable, yet his name surfaced in quiet discussions about labor rights and worker organization, words that unsettled men who preferred obedience over justice. Bridget was praised for her manners and talent, yet society matrons whispered that she carried herself too proudly, as if she had forgotten her place. And then there was the church, Holy Trinity, Catholic. The very idea hollowed Elalina's chest with dread. Grandchildren kneeling before foreign symbols, pledging spiritual loyalty beyond Hartford, beyond New England, beyond everything she recognized as order. She imagined her bloodline diluted not just by heritage but by belief. It was intolerable. As summer bled into autumn, William no longer hid his devotion. He introduced Bridget openly, his affection unmistakable. Elalina watched from the edges of gatherings, observing reactions ripple through drawing rooms and public halls. Surprise sharpened into judgment. Smiles thinned. Conversations stalled when Bridget approached. The city was watching, and it was deciding. The moment of rupture arrived quietly over coffee. William spoke with resolve, announcing that permission had been granted, that a proposal was imminent. Elalina placed her cup down with deliberate calm. She asked him to reconsider. He asked her to finish. She spoke of permanence, of consequences that reached beyond romance, of families' futures, reputations. Her voice was steady, reasonable, rehearsed. William's patience thinned with each sentence. When she spoke of compatibility and background, something hardened in his eyes. He said none of it mattered. She told him it should. She told him it would. Words sharpened. Voices rose, accusations slipped free. William stood, anger scraping the floor along with his chair. He reminded her she had married for love once. She countered that love was not enough when worlds collided. He named her prejudice. She called it reality. The composure she had guarded so fiercely cracked, revealing something raw and unyielding beneath. "These people are not like us," she said. The words hung in the air like a curse. William ended the conversation with finality. He would propose that night, with or without her blessing. After he left, Elalina remained seated long after the room emptied. The coffee cooled. Light shifted. Somewhere beyond the windows, Hartford carried on, unaware that a decision had been made. Arguments had failed. Authority had failed. Love had slipped beyond her reach. But control was not surrendered so easily. When the engagement was announced days later, printed neatly among society notices, the city buzzed with disbelief. Polite curiosity masked scandal. Hartford spoke in lowered voices in corners and corridors, in places where reputations were quietly dissected. Elalina read the announcement in silence. She folded the paper carefully. In that moment, something settled inside her with terrifying clarity. William would marry this girl unless fate intervened. And fate, she decided, could be guided. Because in Elalina Peaton's world, love was not a force to be honored. It was an obstacle, and obstacles, no matter how innocent, were meant to be removed. The engagement bells had begun to ring, but beneath their bright promise, something darker was already counting down toward the altar. All across Hartford, the engagement became a favored poison whispered into porcelain cups and poured alongside brandy in shadowed clubs. Men debated whether William had been bewitched or simply weakened, whether passion had eclipsed reason, or whether Irish blood carried some mysterious pull that respectable society refused to name aloud. In drawing rooms scented with tea and judgment, the question was asked again and again, always ending with a knowing silence. Elalina endured it all with impeccable grace. She smiled, she nodded, she accepted congratulations that arrived wrapped in pity. Friends praised her composure while subtly lamenting her son's unfortunate choice. How modern of William, they murmured, how bold, how unfortunate. Each comment pressed deeper beneath her skin, lodging like splinters she could not extract without screaming. The cruelty peaked at a gathering of charitable women, a room thick with self-righteous benevolence. One voice rose above the rest, carefully sharpened and precisely aimed. Mrs. Fitzgerald spoke of kindness toward immigrant families, of the Christian duty to uplift the unfortunate. Then came the warning, delivered with syrupy concern, about the importance of limits, about knowing where generosity should end. The words landed squarely on Elalina, and the room followed them with expectant eyes. She smiled, redirected the conversation, and felt something corrosive eat through her chest. Women who once sought her approval now dissected her downfall as polite entertainment. The Peaton name, once a master key, had begun to rust. During this season of quiet disgrace, Elalina watched Bridget O'Sullivan with ruthless attention. She observed from the edges of gatherings, memorizing gestures, cataloging expressions, measuring weaknesses. What she discovered disturbed her deeply. Bridget was no caricature of poverty or ignorance. She carried herself with a natural assurance that resisted humiliation. She spoke with warmth without submission, intelligence without arrogance. Even those inclined to scorn her background admitted, grudgingly, that she possessed a grace impossible to manufacture. Worse still was William's devotion. Ella Lenina had never seen her son like this. He orbited Bridget as if tethered. His movements unconsciously aligned with hers, his attention unwavering. He softened in her presence, became gentler, more open. When veiled insults slipped from society's tongues, William bristled, defending Bridget with a loyalty that stirred a memory Ella Lenina wished she could bury. It was the same look Jonathan once wore when defending her against those who whispered about her origins. The resemblance made her recoil. The wedding date loomed closer. October 13th. Bridget insisted on visibility. She refused secrecy. She wanted witnesses. She wanted the city to see their union. To Ella Lenina, this was the final insult, a public spectacle. Every influential family assembled, not to celebrate, but to observe, to judge, to remember. The ceremony would fossilize the association forever, binding the Peyton legacy to scandal in permanent ink. As September bled into October, desperation sharpened Ella Lenina's thoughts. She rehearsed scenarios late into the night. A sudden illness of her own forcing delay. A discreet offer to the bride's father, heavy with implication. A threat of exile and inheritance stripped away. Each possibility collapsed under scrutiny. William would not bend. He would choose Bridget regardless. And cutting him loose entirely would mean surrendering control, the one thing Ella Lenina could not live without. Sleep abandoned her. One night, as rain tapped insistently against the windows, she searched through her late husband's documents, hoping for legal leverage, some forgotten clause or contingency. Instead, she found something far more useful. Jonathan's correspondence with an industrial associate in New York surfaced from the shadows of his files. The letters spoke of compounds and manufacturing innovations, of substances essential to progress yet dangerous in careless hands. Among them was a pale powder discussed with clinical detachment, praised for its utility, and feared for its effects. Ella Lenina read slowly. The substance dissolved easily, left no obvious taste when mixed properly, produced swift symptoms that mimicked natural ailments. Most chilling of all, it rarely revealed itself without advanced examination, procedures seldom pursued when tragedy seemed ordinary enough. The letter warned of its dangers, explaining why Jonathan had ultimately abandoned the venture. Safety risks, public perception, too volatile. Ella Lenina read it again and again. Her pulse thundered in her ears as the shape of a solution emerged, horrifying in its elegance. A sudden illness on a wedding day would be tragic, yes, but believable. Young brides collapsed all the time, overcome by nerves, excitement, weakness, especially those unused to grandeur, especially those from humbler circumstances. Grief would eclipse suspicion. Sympathy would smother inquiry. By dawn, the plan had hardened into certainty. She would obtain the compound through legitimate channels, cloaked in the authority of her husband's unfinished business. No one would question a widow continuing her late husband's work. She would wait patiently, choose her moment carefully, ensure that the act blended seamlessly into the chaos of celebration. Her role would be that of the shocked, grieving matron, horrified by fate's cruelty. Nothing would point to her. On October 8th, with 5 days remaining before vows would be spoken, Ella Lenina set the machinery in motion. Letters were sent, appointments arranged. Her demeanor never wavered. She attended fittings, offered suggestions, played the role expected of her with chilling precision. Those around her mistook her calm for acceptance. They did not see the countdown ticking behind her eyes. Because once Ella Lenina Peyton committed herself to a course, she did not hesitate. She did not doubt. She acted. The bells were ready. The guests were gathering. And somewhere hidden beneath layers of civility and lace, death was preparing to make its entrance quietly, invisibly at the altar. Ella Lenina's journey began before sunrise, the city still yawning as the train carried her south toward New York. She dressed with deliberate restraint, every stitch chosen to project mourning respectability and unassailable purpose. In her reticule lay the proof of her right to be there, letters bearing Jonathan's hand, his authority lingering like a ghost she had learned to wield. By the time the train slowed beneath the iron breath of the city, her resolve had settled into something cold and immovable. Hartwell Chemical Supply occupied a narrow building that smelled faintly of metal and dust. The proprietor, a slight man with restless fingers and spectacles that magnified his unease, recognized Jonathan's name immediately. He spoke of him with admiration, of caution and careful calculation, of a man who understood that progress carried consequences. Elelanina listened patiently, then stepped neatly into the role she had rehearsed, a widow closing unfinished matters, a wife honoring her husband's intellectual pursuits. She spoke with confidence drawn from long nights spent studying technical descriptions meant for men who never imagined such knowledge might be used against them. When she named the compound, the shopkeeper hesitated only briefly. He retrieved a small vial, its contents pale and unassuming, and warned her of its dangers with the detached concern of someone accustomed to risk. She accepted the warning with a nod and paid without haggling. As the vial disappeared into her purse, its weight seemed far greater than its size suggested. On the return journey, she held her bag close, aware that within it lay a future rewritten. There was no trembling, no doubt, only a grim satisfaction that something had finally been done. Hartford welcomed her back with noise and expectation. The days that followed blurred into a careful performance. Bridget invited her into the planning with earnest sincerity, believing kindness could bridge anything. She spoke of family, of unity, of wanting her new mother to feel included. Elelanina responded with practiced warmth, all the while calculating measures and margins, reviewing symptoms and timelines. She consulted medical volumes under the guise of curiosity, cross-referencing accounts of sudden collapse and unexplained death. The dosage took shape in her mind with frightening clarity. Enough to ensure finality, not enough to provoke suspicion. As the wedding morning approached, Elelanina felt an unfamiliar calm settle over her. Before dawn broke, she rose with a sense of purpose so sharp it bordered on exhilaration. She dressed slowly, reverently, selecting the dark silk that spoke of dignity and restraint. Around her neck, she fastened pearls once worn by Jonathan's touch, a private irony that made her lips curve almost imperceptibly. In the mirror stood a woman every inch the devoted matron, a pillar of Hartford society. Nothing in her reflection betrayed the storm beneath. The powder was hidden close, stitched into silk, measured and waiting. She had rehearsed the movement until it lived in her muscles, a gesture as natural as breathing. Adjust the chalice. Smooth the cloth. Release what could not be recalled. Trinity Episcopal Church stood luminous beneath the autumn sky, its stone rising toward heaven as if daring God to intervene. Inside, flowers in muted gold and burgundy softened the severity of the space. The arrangements were modest, but elegant, their simplicity lending the moment an almost sacred purity. For a fleeting second, Elelanina felt something like admiration. She crushed it immediately. The priest greeted her warmly, praising her involvement, her generosity, her devotion to family. She accepted his gratitude with serene humility, moving through the church as though overseeing a stage upon which a final act would soon unfold. Her attention drifted again and again to the chalice resting upon the altar, its silver surface catching the light. A gift from her. How fitting. The wine waited in the vestry, a French vintage she had personally requested. Citing tradition and celebration, she ensured everything was precisely where it should be. Nothing left to chance. As the hour drew closer, footsteps echoed, voices rose, and the church filled with a rustle of anticipation. Guests arrived in clusters, curiosity sharpening their smiles. Elelanina stationed herself near the entrance, greeting each arrival with flawless courtesy. She accepted compliments, returned pleasantries, and felt the countdown ticking behind her eyes. William appeared, radiant and distracted, his happiness a quiet provocation. Bridget followed soon after, transformed by lace and hope, her face luminous with trust. When their eyes met, Bridget smiled with genuine affection, and for a brief, dangerous moment, Elelanina felt the faintest tremor of hesitation. It passed. The ceremony began. Words of devotion floated upward, solemn and sincere. Elelanina moved when the moment came, her body acting before thought could interfere. A simple adjustment, a practiced gesture. The silk sachet emptied without sound, dissolving invisibly into the dark red liquid. The wine accepted its secret willingly, She stepped back into place as vows were spoken, hands folded, expression composed. The chalice was lifted, the blessing given. Bridget drank first. Time seemed to slow. The color drained from the bride's face as confusion flickered across her features. A sharp breath, the tremor. Then horror bloomed where joy had lived moments before. The church erupted into gasps as Bridget collapsed, the sound of her fall echoing like a verdict. White foam touched her lips. Her voice emerged in a broken whisper, a single word of agony that sliced through the sacred silence. Eleanina rushed forward with the others, her cry perfectly pitched, her hands trembling just enough. Inside, something cold and triumphant unfurled. The bells would soon ring, but not for celebration, because beneath the sanctity of vows and the promise of love, something far older and darker had claimed its due, and Hartford, watching in stunned silence, would remember this wedding not for what it united, but for what it destroyed. She stood at the threshold of the church as though she belonged to the stone itself, greeting each arrival with a smile polished by years of practice. Her voice was warm, her posture impeccable, her eyes alert to every movement. She watched families drift inside beneath the high archway, noting the cut of their coats, the stiffness of borrowed finery, the way pride and anxiety clung to them like damp wool. When Patrick O'Sullivan entered with his younger children, their clothes too new, too carefully chosen, her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His pride burned bright and careless, and the sight of it sent a sharp flare of resentment through her chest. That pride did not belong here, not among the pit and name, not beneath this roof. Carriages continued to arrive, their passengers stepping down with rehearsed elegance. The city's upper circle surveyed the gathering with carefully neutral expressions, their glances lingering just long enough to measure, to judge, to divide. She saw the subtle choreography unfold exactly as she had anticipated. Polite nods given without warmth, distance maintained without open cruelty. A silent declaration of who belonged and who merely occupied space. The balance of the room pleased her. Order, after all, was a form of righteousness. When her son appeared beside his chosen companion, adjusting his collar with nervous fingers, something softer stirred beneath her resolve. He looked radiant in his happiness, earnest and unaware, his face open to the future like an unlocked door. For a fleeting instant, love pierced her like a blade. Then the moment hardened into certainty. He did not understand the danger he was stepping into. She did, and that knowledge made her steady. The bells began their slow summons, sound rolling through the nave like a tide. A hush spread among the guests as the bride emerged at the far end of the aisle. Against her will, breath caught in her throat. The young woman was luminous, her hair catching the light, her dress simple yet perfectly shaped by her own careful hands. She carried flowers pale as bone and cloud, and her smile was so unguarded it seemed to banish shadow itself. As she walked forward beside her father, a ripple of warmth passed through the pews, faces softened. Even the most rigid observers betrayed a flicker of admiration. Joy, when genuine, was a dangerous thing. The ritual unfolded with solemn grace. Words about devotion and sacred bonds echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling, heavy with promise. The couple spoke their vows clearly, eyes locked together, voices unwavering. From her seat near the front, she watched with a hand resting lightly over silk and secret. Soon, she told herself, soon this illusion would shatter, and her son would be spared a life built on weakness and misplaced affection. When the priest turned toward the table, prepared for the blessing, her pulse quickened. This was the instant she had rehearsed in silence, in darkness, in dreams that never reached morning. She rose smoothly and approached, her expression serene. Her request to assist was met with grateful acceptance. As the priest addressed the congregation, speaking of unity and shared burdens, her fingers moved with practiced ease. The powder slipped into the wine like snow into blood, disappearing without protest. She stirred once gently, as though honoring the ritual. No trace remained, no warning lingered. She returned to her place, heart thunderous, ears ringing. The couple stepped forward, hands entwined, faces alight. The cup passed from priest to groom, from groom to bride. She watched the young woman drink deeply, her throat moving, her smile unbroken. For a heartbeat, time seemed to hold its breath. Then the cup was returned, and the moment passed into applause. They processed out together, laughter and congratulations washing over them. She took her position among the well-wishers, responding automatically, her gaze never leaving the bride. Every flicker of movement was scrutinized. Every breath counted. She knew what should come next. A faint pallor, a catch in the chest, a discomfort easily dismissed as nerves. The poison was patient but inevitable. Minutes stretched thin. The bride remained radiant, her laughter bright and unrestrained. She moved easily, greeting guests, accepting embraces. Color stayed high in her cheeks. Her breathing remained calm. With each passing moment, unease crept higher, coiling around her ribs. This was not how it was meant to unfold. Doubt whispered. Had she misjudged? Had the dose been insufficient? Panic, sharp and unfamiliar, pricked at the edges of her composure. She forced her smile to remain fixed, her posture unchanged, even as her thoughts spiraled. The crowd shifted toward celebration, unaware of the tension threading the air. The bells had finished their song, but something else was listening now, waiting. And then at last the smallest change, a pause in laughter, a hand pressed briefly to a chest, so subtle it could be missed by anyone not watching with hunger. Relief surged through her, cold and electric. It had begun. Whatever followed would unfold beyond her control, but the path was set. Around them, voices rose, glasses clinked, life surged forward in ignorant celebration. Beneath it all, something darker stirred, patient and precise. The church had borne witness, and its stones would remember. What had begun as a union would end as a warning, etched into memory and whispered long after the echoes of joy had faded into silence. Doubt crept in like a slow infection. Had her hand faltered when she measured the powder, or had fate itself intervened to mock her precision? She searched Bridget's face again and again, hunting for the smallest betrayal of weakness, but found only laughter, color, vitality. The poison should have announced itself by now. It should have whispered through the blood, tightened the chest, burned its warning into flesh. Instead, the bride moved as if untouched, and that failure gnawed at Eleanina with merciless persistence. The procession drifted from the church toward the mansion, carriages rolling beneath a sky heavy with autumn promise. Eleanina walked beside the priest, her voice calm, her replies polite, while inside her thoughts screamed in fury. Every step felt like a countdown without numbers, each breath another accusation. She had planned for every variable except this one. Survival. Resistance. The unthinkable possibility that her careful work had amounted to nothing. Inside the mansion, warmth and light greeted the guests. Flowers glowed in rich seasonal hues, her finest porcelain gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, and the scent of prepared delicacies filled the air. It was a scene of abundance, generosity, control. Oysters rested on beds of ice, roasted birds glistened beneath herbs, pastries waited like pale temptations. Bottles of champagne stood ready, their corks trembling with promise. This was the world she had built, and it was slipping from her grasp. She moved through the rooms as hostess and guardian, offering smiles that felt carved from stone. Time stretched unbearably. Nearly an hour had passed since the chalice touched Bridget's lips, and still there was no collapse, no cry, no visible unraveling. The young woman removed her gloves and greeted Hartford's finest with ease, her posture elegant, her voice steady. She belonged far too comfortably in this room. A familiar matron approached, praise dripping with careful condescension, remarking on the bride's unexpected refinement. Eleanina responded with practiced grace, her words smooth, her tone approving, though each syllable tasted of dust and defeat. If the poison had failed, then this marriage would endure. The name she had guarded so fiercely would be entwined forever with blood she despised. The thought pressed against her chest like a vice. She watched Bridget obsessively as the breakfast continued. The bride ate lightly but without hesitation, savoring flavors, raising her glass more than once. Laughter followed her from group to group as she spoke of travel, of beginnings, of the city awaiting them beyond Hartford. There was no tremor in her hand, no pallor beneath her skin. With every passing moment, panic sharpened into something darker, something feral. At last, unable to endure the spectacle any longer, Eleanina withdrew. She shut herself into her private study, the door closing with a force that betrayed her restraint. She paced the room, breath shallow, mind racing through impossible alternatives. She had gambled everything on this single act. Exposure, disgrace, Ruin loomed like spectres at her shoulder. The arsenic should have been merciless. Instead, it had betrayed her. Then, from beyond the door, voices rose. Concern fractured the hum of celebration. A name was called, urgent, insistent. A physician was being summoned. Hope surged through her, sharp and electric, banishing despair in an instant. Perhaps the poison had merely been patient. Perhaps it had waited for the perfect moment to reveal itself. She composed her features and returned to the gathering, her expression one of alarmed devotion. What she found ignited something close to triumph. Bridget sat slumped in a high-backed chair, her skin drained of warmth, her breath shallow and quick. One hand clutched her abdomen, the other trembled against the armrest. William knelt beside her, fear stripping him of composure. The bride's voice wavered as she spoke, confusion clouding her eyes. Pain had arrived without warning, she said, burning and sudden. The physician moved swiftly, his demeanor grave. He examined her with practiced efficiency, checking pulse and pupils, asking questions that cut through the room like blades. Symptoms spilled out in fragments. Nausea. Fire in the throat. Air that would not come easily. Eleanina stepped closer, her face etched with concern, though inside she reveled in vindication. The poison had not failed. It had simply waited. The doctor issued brisk instructions, sending for supplies, ordering remedies with urgency that stirred unease among the guests. Servants hurried away, their footsteps echoing like a drumbeat of inevitability. Bridget's condition worsened with terrifying speed. Sweat beaded across her brow despite the chill. Her breathing grew ragged, each inhale a struggle. Her hands shook uncontrollably, knuckles white against the chair. When she tried to speak again, her words emerged as a whisper, thin and strained. Her gaze lifted, locking onto Eleanina with unsettling clarity. There was recognition there, or perhaps accusation. Her lips trembled as she spoke of the wine, of an odd taste remembered too late. The room seemed to tilt. Sound dulled. Eleanina felt the cold seize her veins, freezing blood mid-flow. Was it delirium, the poison gnawing at mind as well as body? Or had the girl sensed the truth in her final clarity? Eleanina leaned closer, her voice gentle, maternal, perfectly controlled. She asked what she meant, her expression a portrait of concern. But the silence that followed felt heavy with judgment. Around them, celebration had dissolved into dread. The mansion, once filled with light and promise, now held its breath. Shadows lengthened. Whispers gathered, and in that suspended moment, as life faltered and secrets pressed against the surface, Eleanina understood that the ending she had envisioned were only the beginning of something far more terrible. Every intervention meant risk. Every swallow of antidote. Every desperate effort to keep Bridget conscious tightened the noose around Eleanina's own future. The possibility that the young woman might live became a nightmare more vivid than any vision of death. Survival would not bring mercy. It would bring questions, examinations, whispers spoken too loudly behind closed doors. And so Eleanina stood trapped in the most grotesque contradiction imaginable, silently begging for a bride's life to end, while smoothing her expression into the mask of a devoted mother, welcoming tragedy with grace. The doctor paused briefly in his work, his brow creased with concern. He addressed William, his voice measured but edged with urgency, remarking on the quality of the wine and the overwhelming nature of such a day. Yet something in Bridget's earlier words had lodged deep in his mind. He had gone still, unnaturally so, like a man who had suddenly glimpsed a truth he could not unsee. His gaze moved deliberately, from the trembling bride to Eleanina, then back again, sharp and probing. He asked, with careful emphasis, what wine had been used during the ceremony. Eleanina answered smoothly, naming a trusted source, a familiar vintage, something long associated with family celebrations. Her tone was calm, practiced, unassailable, but the doctor interrupted her, not unkindly, yet with unmistakable authority. This was no longer a matter of nerves or excess emotion. He'd heard too many stories, seen too many bodies betray secrets they could not keep. The word poison entered the room like a curse. It struck the air and spread outward, rippling through the guests in waves of disbelief. Gasps rose. Murmurs followed. Faces drained of color as understanding crept in, slow and terrible. William recoiled as though struck, his disbelief raw and vocal. How could such a thing be possible? Bridget had consumed nothing that had not been shared, The doctor answered with brutal clarity. Not everything had been shared. Only 2 people had partaken of the ceremonial wine. Only one of them was collapsing. Elelonina felt the world tilt. The room seemed to contract, walls inching closer as her carefully arranged reality fractured. The doctor's logic advanced with merciless precision, stripping away alternatives, closing doors one by one. Her thoughts raced frantic, clawing for escape. She suggested contamination, ancient pipes, some unseen flaw hidden within the building itself. Her words spilled out quickly, almost too quickly. The doctor listened, but his eyes never softened. They remained fixed on her, assessing, weighing, measuring. Beneath his composed exterior, suspicion was taking root. She could feel it growing, cold and invasive, stripping her bare layer by layer, and all the while Bridget's condition worsened. The bride's breathing became ragged and even, as though her lungs no longer remembered their purpose. The warmth fled her skin, leaving behind a pallor that frightened even the most hardened observers. When she attempted to speak, the words dissolved into meaningless whispers, her consciousness slipping like sand through open fingers. The doctor made his decision. There was no more time for debate. She had to be moved immediately if there was any hope of saving her. The word "save" thundered in Elelonina's skull, echoing again and again, louder than the gasps, louder than the hurried footsteps of servants preparing transport. She had believed death would be swift, final, absolute. The notion that medicine might intercept her design had never truly occurred to her. Now that oversight threatened to destroy everything. As arrangements were made, she stood frozen between 2 terrors. One hope, dark and desperate, prayed that Bridget would die before reaching help. The other, colder and more rational, imagined a living bride opening her eyes, forming accusations, pointing a trembling finger toward the woman who had smiled as she poisoned her. The consequences of that vision were unbearable. Courts, scandal, disgrace, the annihilation of a name she had guarded with ruthless devotion. The carriage ride unfolded in suffocating silence. Bridget's breaths grew shallow, fragile, as though each one might be her last. William hovered beside her, fear etched into every line of his face, whispering promises she could no longer hear. Elelonina sat rigid, hands folded, her mind screaming prayers she had never believed in, bargaining with a fate she had tried to control. When they arrived at the doctor's practice, urgency consumed the space. What had once been a place of routine ailments transformed into a battleground between life and death. Bridget was carried inside, her body limp, her spirit wavering on the edge of oblivion. The doctor wasted no time. Remedies were prepared with practiced speed, their purpose grim and singular. Salt water was forced past unwilling lips in an effort to expel the poison. When that failed, mixtures of milk and egg whites followed, desperate attempts to trap the toxin before it could complete its work. Each action was accompanied by explanations meant to soothe, to reassure, though none could truly hide the danger. Elelonina watched every movement with mounting dread. Each treatment felt like a blade pressed closer to her own throat. With every retch, every labored breath, the balance shifted unpredictably between salvation and exposure. The room reeked of fear, sharp and metallic, mingling with the sterile scents of medicine, and still the poison fought back. Bridget convulsed faintly, her body rebelling against both toxin and cure. The struggle played out in real time, raw and merciless under flickering lamps and watchful eyes. Somewhere deep within Elelonina, something cracked. Not guilt, not remorse, but the realization that once death is invited in, it never arrives alone. As the doctor worked relentlessly, as William hovered on the brink of collapse, Elelonina understood the final truth. She had not orchestrated an ending. She had unleashed a reckoning. And no matter who survived this night, the shadows she had summoned would never truly leave. The doctor's voice cut through the thickened air with quiet finality. He explained that his assistant had been dispatched back to Trinity Church, instructed to retrieve the sacred vessel used during the blessing. That chalice, he said, would speak more clearly than any speculation. It would reveal the truth of how Bridget had been poisoned. At those words, Elelonina felt her hands betray her, fingers curling tightly against her skirts. The chalice was not merely silver and tradition. It was a witness. Whatever remained clinging to its surface would confirm everything she had worked so carefully to conceal. Proof would bring questions, and questions would bring ruin. When the assistant returned, time seemed to fracture. The man entered carrying the chalice swaddled in cloth, followed by the bottle that had once held the ceremonial wine. They were placed gently on the table, reverently, as though everyone sensed the weight of what they contained. Dr. Harrison examined them with methods unfamiliar to Elelonina, small reactions and powders, subtle changes that spoke a language she could not deny. His conclusion came without hesitation. Traces of arsenic lingered unmistakably in both the cup and the wine. This had not been chance. This had been intention. Someone had deliberately introduced death into the heart of a sacred rite. William recoiled as though struck, disbelief tearing through him. Who could have done such a thing, he demanded. Bridget had harmed no one. She carried no grudges, no enemies. Dr. Harrison did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes traveled slowly across the room, lingering on each face, weighing each silence. When his gaze finally settled on Elelonina, she felt stripped bare. The true question, the doctor explained, was access. Who had been close enough to the wine, alone enough, trusted enough to act unseen? Elelonina forced herself to speak, offering possibilities in a steady voice. Staff, clergy, any number of unseen hands. The church was not a locked sanctuary. But Dr. Harrison was unmoved. Arsenic was not something stumbled upon. It required knowledge, resources, deliberate effort. This was no impulse. It was design, planning, purpose, and with each word, the invisible circle around Elelonina tightened. Then Bridget stirred. A faint movement, barely perceptible, drew every eye. After so long suspended between breaths, her lashes fluttered. Confusion clouded her gaze as awareness returned. William rushed to her side, his relief trembling as he spoke her name. She asked where she was, what had happened, her voice fragile as glass. As her eyes adjusted, they found Elelonina, and in that instant something shifted. Memory sparked. Recognition ignited. She spoke of the wine, of a taste that lingered wrong on her tongue. Not sharp, not obvious, but altered. And then she paused, searching the depths of her mind, pulling something half-buried into the light. She remembered movement near the chalice, someone present where they did not belong. Someone stirring. The room seemed to contract around Elelonina as Bridget's gaze fixed on her with devastating clarity. When the name fell from her lips, it shattered the last illusion of safety. The accusation detonated in silence. William turned to his mother as if seeing her for the first time, horror hollowing his expression. He begged her to deny it, to undo what had just been spoken. But there was no longer any refuge in pretense. The mask slipped away, and with it fell the careful civility she had worn for years. She spoke without apology, without tears. She spoke of preservation, of bloodlines, of legacy, of a future she believed she was saving from contamination. The words spilled freely now, sharpened by conviction rather than shame. She spoke of ancestry as threat, of love as weakness, of purity as destiny. William staggered backward, grief and revulsion warring within him. He named her cruelty for what it was. He named Bridget his wife. He named the children they might have had. And at that, Elelonina's restraint fractured entirely. She spat her fears aloud, unfiltered and vicious. Better extinction than dilution. Better an ending than change. Dr. Harrison stepped forward then, the weight of authority settling over the room like a closing door. His voice was calm, resolute, unyielding. What had been revealed could not be undone. What had been attempted could not be forgiven. The law would be summoned. Justice would have its turn. As the words fell, Elelonina finally understood. The reckoning she had unleashed had reached its final form, not death but exposure, not silence but truth. And in that moment, as shadows pressed inward and whispers gathered strength, the legacy she had guarded so fiercely crumbled into dust, leaving only a cautionary echo to haunt the halls of Gospel of the Haunted, where love was nearly murdered and hatred was finally unmasked. Her confession echoed in the room like a final crack of thunder, and the doctor did not allow it to dissipate into disbelief or denial. He reminded her, calmly and publicly, that she had admitted to attempted murder before a room full of witnesses. There was no retreat from words once spoken into the open air. Elelonina answered with a brittle laugh, sharp and humorless. She spoke as if the world itself were on her side, as if power and pedigree could bend justice into silence. Did anyone truly believe, she scoffed, that Hartford would condemn one of its own for trying to shield her family from what she called contamination. Men of influence, she insisted, shared her fears in private rooms and closed meetings. Her thoughts were not radical, only unspoken. But the doctor did not flinch. He reminded her that poison erased privilege, that crime did not soften when wrapped in silk or tradition. The law, he said, was blind to ancestry and unmoved by prejudice. No amount of wealth or widowhood could excuse an act meant to end a human life. What followed would grip the region like a tightening vice. When the trial began, the courtroom became a stage upon which the anxieties of an entire era were laid bare. Newspapers devoured every detail, ink spilling daily across pages from Hartford outward to distant cities hungry for scandal and symbolism. A woman of standing accused of poisoning her son's bride was not merely a crime story. It was a mirror held up to a divided society. The judge presiding was himself a product of the word Elenina believed protected her. He knew her name. He knew her circles, and yet, seated beneath the weight of the law, he was bound to evidence rather than allegiance. Each testimony tightened the narrative into something inescapable. The physician's science spoke with ruthless clarity. The chemical traces did not lie. Nor did the words spoken in the aftermath, nor the trembling recollection of a bride who had stared death in the face on what should have been her happiest day. The prosecution painted the act as cold and deliberate, not born of panic, but of calculation. They spoke of arsenic procured with intention, of timing chosen with care, of a woman who weighed a life against reputation and chose destruction. This was not madness, they argued. This was ideology sharpened into a weapon. The defense tried desperately to soften the edges. They spoke of maternal devotion, of emotional collapse, of a woman pushed beyond reason by fear of social ruin. They pleaded for sympathy, for understanding, for mercy. But their words dissolved under the undeniable structure of planning. Temporary insanity could not account for measured doses, rehearsed gestures, or a hand steady enough to stir death into wine beneath stained glass and prayer. When Bridget rose to testify, the courtroom stilled. She bore no outward scars, yet the memory lived in her eyes. She spoke without venom, without theatrics. She did not seek vengeance. She sought truth. She spoke of love, of shock, of the realization that her very existence had been deemed an offense worthy of erasure. Her dignity dismantled every attempt to portray her as lesser, unworthy, or crude. In that quiet strength, the jury saw the lie at the heart of Elenina's beliefs. Then William took the stand, and whatever composure remained in the room fractured. His voice carried the weight of betrayal deeper than any accusation. He spoke of lessons learned at his mother's knee, of honor preached and values instilled. And then he spoke of the moment those teachings demanded he stand against her. Love, he said, could not excuse evil. Loyalty could not silence truth. If justice meant losing his mother, then justice must still be served. The verdict came swiftly. Guilt, spoken aloud, settled like ash. The sentence followed, heavy and deliberate. Years were named, consequences declared. The judge spoke of civilization itself, of how hatred disguised as protection threatened the very fabric of society. When prejudice reached for poison, the law must answer without hesitation. Elenina received her fate with the same rigid composure she had worn all along. No tears fell, no pleas escaped her lips. She did not look at her son. She did not look at the woman she had tried to erase. She walked away wrapped in silence, leaving behind a name stripped of reverence. The fallout rippled outward. Doors once open closed quietly. Invitations ceased. Whispers replaced greetings. William and Bridget found Hartford's warmth had turned brittle and cold, and so they left. In another city among strangers they rebuilt. Life resumed its fragile forward motion. Love endured. Children were born. Futures unfolded despite everything meant to prevent them. Elenina's years behind stone walls ground away what pride remained. When she returned, diminished and forgotten, the world no longer waited for her. She lived quietly, dying without reconciliation, without legacy, without absolution. The chalice, once sacred, was destroyed, melted down, transformed into aid for those she had despised. A final, silent inversion of purpose. And in churches and parlors, in whispered retellings and hushed warnings, her story endured within the dark canon of gospel of the haunted, not as a tale of madness, but as a reminder That hatred, when given power, does not merely wound, it reaches for the altar, and it poisons everything it touches. The echoes of the courtroom lingered long after the gavel fell, a hollow resonance that seemed to cling to Hartford itself. Elenina Petan, once the embodiment of grace and authority, now moved through the world like a shadow of her former self, stripped of fortune, of family, and of influence. Behind the walls of Connecticut State Prison, she learned what it meant for power to crumble, for social standing to dissolve into whispers and pointed fingers. Days passed in monotony and despair, her only companions the muffled cries of the imprisoned, the cold iron of her cell, and the ceaseless tick of time that neither forgave nor paused. Outside, the world she had tried so fiercely to control moved on. William and Bridget, bound now by something stronger than fear, began a life together marked by triumph over the darkness that had shadowed their wedding day. They left Hartford behind, the streets that once whispered scandal replaced by the unfamiliar avenues of Boston, where no one would remember the horror that had unfolded beneath the gilded ceilings of the Petan mansion. There they built a family, a home, a sanctuary untouched by the poison of hatred and social prejudice. Bridget flourished, her intelligence and kindness illuminating every corner of her new life. She became a bridge between worlds, between the immigrants her mother-in-law had despised and the elite families she had once sought to impress. Her charity work, her dedication to the downtrodden, her elegant strength, all of it served as a quiet, persistent repudiation of the venom that had threatened to end her life. And William, carrying the weight of his mother's betrayal, transformed his grief into resolve, ensuring that justice, and not vengeance, guided their path forward. Meanwhile, Elenina's existence became a study in the slow erosion of pride. The wealth she had hoarded, the careful calculations and alliances she had orchestrated, melted away beneath the unyielding pressure of law and consequence. Letters were returned unopened, visitors ceased to knock, and the once illustrious Petan name became synonymous with disgrace. She lived among strangers quietly, as though each day of her diminished life was both punishment and penance. There were no reconciliations, no embraces of grandchildren she never met, only the cold shadow of what had been, and the relentless knowledge of what she had done. The chalice, the instrument of her carefully plotted wrath, was gone, melted down, reshaped, repurposed into aid for the very people she had despised. Even in destruction, it carried a quiet triumph of justice. Trinity Church instituted new measures, guards for their sacred rituals, a vigilance born not of fear of the divine but of the fallibility of those entrusted with it. And in quiet parlor rooms, in hushed whispers, the story persisted. It endured because it carried a lesson too potent, too horrifying to be forgotten. Hatred, when armed with cunning and opportunity, does not merely destroy, it contaminates every surface it touches. It turns family against family, faith against faith, love against itself. Elenina had believed herself the protector of a legacy, the savior of a lineage, but in reality, she had been the architect of ruin. Every act intended to preserve a name instead exposed it to irreparable decay. And yet, even as she faded from society, even as her fortune and influence crumbled, her shadow remained, a cautionary echo threading through the lives she had tried to dominate. In the homes of the living, in the minds of those who witnessed or heard of her deeds, her story took on a life of its own. It was no longer simply a tragedy of ambition, no longer merely a crime of poisoned wine and calculated malice. It became a tale whispered with awe and fear, a warning that the veneer of respectability can conceal the darkest of intentions. Parents warned children of the consequences of unchecked prejudice, socialites spoke in quiet, wary tones of the fragility of appearances, and lovers learned that passion alone cannot shield them from the enmity of those who value heritage above humanity. And so, within the canon of gospel of the haunted, her legacy took root, not as a figure of infamy alone, but as a symbol that power without conscience is a perilous thing, that pride and obsession, when left unchecked, can turn even the most familiar spaces into arenas of terror. The Petan mansion, once vibrant with laughter, stood silent and hollow in memory, its halls echoing with whispers of deceit, betrayal, and the near sacrifice of innocent life. Even in death, Elenina's presence lingered, a warning in the shadows, a tremor beneath the surface of civility. She had sought to control, to protect, to purify her world, but all she had achieved was ruin and revelation. Hartford, and the generations that followed, would remember her not for the elegance she had possessed, but for the darkness she had wielded, and for the lesson that hatred, when cloaked in refinement, is far more dangerous than any open threat, not as a story of madness, not as a tale of fleeting crime, but as a testament to the enduring power of truth, exposure, and the inevitability of consequence. In the quiet moments, when doors close and lights dim, when shadows gather and whispers swirl, the story of Elenina Peton remains alive, a chilling heartbeat in the fabric of history, echoing endlessly within the pages of Gospel of the Haunted, because in the end, the poison she had so meticulously prepared did not merely threaten life, it revealed it. It exposed human fragility, moral weakness, and the ultimate reckoning that awaits those who let hatred rule where compassion should dwell. Her legacy, frozen between crime and caution, survives not as spectacle alone, but as a dark, hypnotic mirror, reflecting all that can go wrong when fear and prejudice override humanity. And so the tale concludes, yet it never truly ends. For in every gathering, every celebration, every whispered moment of dread, Elenina's shadow lingers, reminding us that some acts, some intentions, are too dark ever to vanish, and that in the quietest corners, horror waits patiently for the next story to unfold.